Duelist of the Roses is the weirdest Yu-Gi-Oh game I've ever played. It ushered in an era of Yu-Gi-Oh video games that took a crazy turn. From this point on, Yu-Gi-Oh games on console would be extremely experimental, constantly trying new things, twisting the beloved card game into something wild, crazy, and almost indistinguishable from the original source material. Duelist of the Roses was the first to experiment, and perhaps the most insane. It took the beloved characters you know and love from the show and turned them into a historical period piece drama. It took the iconic card game you remember playing on the playground into some weird tactical chess monstrosity. It was a game from a different era, and today, we're going to be analyzing it from top to bottom to see just how weird this game was, and if it was actually any good. I'm Ashton Lavelle, and this is Yu-Gi-Oh! The Duelist of the Roses. Duelist of the Roses was released on the PlayStation 2 in North America on February 18, 2003, nearly 2 years after it was released in Japan. It was the second Yu-Gi-Oh game to release on consoles, and the first to release on the PS2. It marked a turning point in console Yu-Gi-Oh games, where the traditional card game simulator style of gameplay found a home on handheld consoles. At-home consoles saw Konami experiment with the franchise, developing some of the weirdest games that morphed what you thought Yu-Gi-Oh could be. Upon release, Duelist of the Roses received less than stellar reviews. Outlets gave mixed evaluations of the new gameplay mechanics and disparaged the difficulty. Sound familiar? PlayStation Magazine gave it a 2.5 out of 5 stars and stated that the difficulty was, quote, designed to make you feel like a total loser. Some outlets thought the presentation and story made up for the mediocre gameplay experience. Game Informer, the highest outlet on the game with an 8 out of 10 score, went as far as to say that Duelist of the Roses is, quote, the best card game that money can buy. It currently sits at a 59 average on Metacritic. For me, I remember this game mostly as a rental game. I can remember going to my local Hollywood Video, when that was still around, and constantly renting this game out over and over. As a young child, the gameplay concepts definitely went over my head, but I remember thinking the outfits and presentation were awesome and mind-blowing. Seeing the monsters of the anime brought to life with the power of the PS2, watching them battle in fully rendered 3D graphics, it was all I ever dreamed of. But then, when I actually played it, I was shocked to find that the game had barely anything to do with the card game. I wanted the card game from the show brought to life in a video game, but what I got instead was some overly complicated chessboard-style game that only kinda looked like Yu-Gi-Oh! As a result, I never finished it despite renting it many times over the years. That changes today. I can now say I have played and finished Duelist of the Roses for the first time since renting it out over 20 years ago. My thoughts lie somewhere in the middle of PlayStation Magazine's 2.5 star review and Game Informer's 8 out of 10 review. Duelist of the Roses is a strange mix of great ideas, amazing production value, and wacky moments. To give you a full view of this wild experience, we're gonna have to take you on a trip back in time to the end of the medieval era in Western Europe. The year is 1485, the tail end of the long conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. On one side, the Lancastrians, headed by Henry Tudor, On the other, the Yorkists, headed by Christian Rosencreuz. By the end of this conflict, a new King of England will be crowned, and the balance of power in Western Europe will be forever changed. If that sounded like a little bit of a history lesson, well, it's because it was. Duelist of the Roses tells the story of the literal historical events at the end of the Wars of the Roses, a conflict perhaps even more famous for inspiring stories like Game of Thrones than the conflict itself. Unlike Game of Thrones, however, who simply used the general royal conflicts from this period as a template for George R.R. Martin's own characters and world, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses decided to literally tell the story and history of the war as it was fought. The difference being that the main figures of this conflict turn out to actually be the anime characters that we know and love. Henry Tudor, the man who would become the next King of England, is actually just Yugimoto. The mythical figure of Rosencreuz is actually Seto Kaiba. Every character in this game has a counterpart in the real history of the war. It's hilarious how they implemented it too. There is no space-time nonsense, no spirit of the pharaoh occupying the body of Henry Tudor or anything like that. When you meet Yugi, he just casually states that he is, in fact, the Henry Tudor of history, but that he just casually goes by Yugi because why not? It's ridiculous and absurd. They just brush this comment aside as if it's not the weirdest thing you've ever heard. This will happen multiple times over the course of the game, as if the writers wanted you to just completely ignore or forget that they even said it. Which begs the question, why have it in the first place? You as the player are the legendary Rose Duelist, a mythical master strategist from prophecy summoned from the future back into the past in order to resolve this conflict. You must now pick a side. Follow history and join Yugi, aka Henry Tudor, and the Lancastrians, or change the course of history by following Kaiba, aka Rosencreuz, and the Yorkists. So let me get this straight. The entire premise of this game is based on the Wars of the Roses, in which all of the major characters are from the anime, and to resolve their conflict, they call on a completely different person from the future to the past to solve their own problem. This is the weirdest choice for a first Yu-Gi-Oh! Game on PS2 I could ever imagine. After picking a side, you're given a choice of a starter deck. These choices are determined by your name in some weird algorithm. For me, I just entered my normal name, Ashton, and was able to choose between the Fairy King Truesdale deck, Patrician of Darkness, or Twin-Headed Behemoth. So, of course, I chose Twin-Headed Behemoth because dragons are awesome. With our starter deck in tow, and after picking our side, we're told that in order to resolve the conflict and head home, we must go out and defeat leaders from the other side in an ancient card game. If we win 8 rose cards from the opposition, we'll be able to complete the prophecy and return home. Now, why an ancient card game is required to end this literal war fought on the battlefield with knights, cavalry, bowmen, and ships, I have no idea, but we had to have a game to play, so whatever, I guess. For my journey, I picked the Yorkists at first, and after getting my ass handed to me, because apparently it's the harder campaign, I decided to double back and sided with the Lancastrians. Evidently, using the power of the White Rose cards, the Yorkists have created a barrier between England and France, where Yugi is headquartered, preventing him from invading. Our goal is to take out all of the Yorkist commanders, take their White Rose cards, and release the barrier so Yugi can fulfill his destiny and become the next King of England. First up in our bingo book, the insect boy himself, Weevil Underwood. Dueling in this game is odd. If you bought this game back in 2003 and expected, as I did, to play Yu-Gi-Oh! As you know and love it, but brought to life with amazing 3D renders of your favorite monsters, you'd be sorely disappointed. The 3D models of monsters do look great, which is why it's kind of a shame they're used in this weird battle system. In Duelist of the Roses, duels play out on a large chess-style board. Each player has a leader card, in my case the Twin-Headed Behemoth, for Weevil, his basic insect. These cards are your lifeline. You use them to summon other monsters, they have special abilities that can help your monsters on the board, and are essentially your queen that must be protected at all costs. If your leader is attacked, that is considered a direct hit to your life points. Reach 0, and you lose the duel. When you summon a monster, you can either summon them in face-up or face-down attack or defense. Then, they can move 1 space each turn, slowly crawling their way toward the enemy. Monsters attack each other, much like in regular Yu-Gi-Oh! And, similar to the previous console game, Forbidden Memories, you can play 2 or more cards from your hand at the same time in an attempt to fuse them into something more powerful. And, just like in Forbidden Memories, you always draw to 5 cards each turn to make up for the cards you lose fusing. If you'd like to know how I feel about that system more in depth, you should check out the video I made on Forbidden Memories. The major difference between the two systems is that Duelist of the Roses is definitively more strict in the possible fusions you can make. In Forbidden Memories, weird combinations of cards could net you some interesting results, but in Duelist of the Roses, fusions seem much more streamlined. The battle system is interesting in theory, but cumbersome in practice. Duels can take forever as your opponent constantly runs away from your assault, spawning creature after creature behind them to stall out the game, even when defeat is inevitable. A game that should last 10 minutes ends up taking 40. There are some ways to help mitigate this, but they require so much grinding that it isn't worth it and probably nets out to taking the same amount of time overall. For example, your leader can rank up and earn power-ups for your creatures like extra movement, but it takes so long for that to happen that by the time you rank them up, you could have already beaten the game. On top of that, it never feels necessary as you can beat the game without a single rank up at all, like I did. It really makes me question some of the difficulty criticisms from reviewers back in the day. Never heard that one before. The system has moments of greatness. There were a few times in which it felt like a real battlefield, with me at the head of an army of monsters, building up a wall of defenses, gathering up a powerful force, flanking the enemy into a corner, and wiping out their forces before going in for the final blow. There were also a handful of times in which I felt like I had to seriously think ahead, consider my opponent's next few turns, and plan accordingly. See, each turn you're given 3 stars. These stars correspond to the stars on each monster. You can only summon a monster if you have the same or more stars as that monster. So, if you have 4 stars, you can only summon level 4 or lower monsters. This meant that I'd have to constantly be planning ahead and deciding the right time to drop a huge monster onto the field versus smaller monsters with perhaps a strong effect. When monsters battle, there's also this really awesome animated sequence that plays, showing off each monster and their special moves. I love these little animations. I could watch them all day, and just seeing each monster's special ability is a treat. They do drag on a little too long though. It doesn't need to take 5 whole minutes, especially when you're battling potentially a dozen monsters per duel. You're pretty much forced to turn them off at a certain point. There are some other interesting mechanics to play around with as well. Spells and traps exist in this game and can be played just like a monster card. However, if a monster attempts to attack a spell or trap card, they will automatically overtake the card, so you have to be careful where you place them and move them. Some trap cards especially have a proximity limit, a set area in which they will activate their effect, while others will activate no matter how far away from the opponent they are. They also cost 0 stars to play, so it's a good way to fill up your board or set up a defense while saving up stars for a huge monster. It's a cool way to implement spells and traps in a chessboard style system like this. There is one mechanic above all that I learned was more important than perhaps any other. After defeating Weevil, I took on Rex Raptor, who taught me one of the most important lessons in the entire game. Land is everything. Every opponent has their own unique field that you have to navigate. For Rex, he has a field full of wasteland tiles, which power up his dinosaur monsters, as well as 3 rows of labyrinth tiles, which are impassable by any monster outside of exactly Wall Shadow. Compared to Weevil, who had pretty much an open board of forest tiles, this battlefield requires a lot more strategy. For one, the labyrinth tiles essentially created narrow lanes that both players have to navigate around. Second, Rex's dinos can become obscenely powerful on the wasteland tiles, allowing them to completely trample over my monsters. Oh, and they can also move at double the speed of a normal card when on wastelands, meaning that running away is a fool's errand. To beat him, we'd have to master the art of land. By using spell cards like forest or mountain, we can change a chunk of terrain spaces into land that is more advantageous to us, taking away the bonuses Rex dinos receive and granting them to our own monsters. This becomes the meta for Duelist of the Roses. If you can control the land, you control the board and therefore the game. Once I realized this, I immediately went back and grinded duels against Weevil over and over until I created a competent insect forest strategy with a splash of dragons. With this bug-filled deck, I could transform the battlefield almost at will to my advantage, buff up my bugs even more with cards like insect armor, and steamroll most of the early opponents. Honestly, I'm shocked how well this strategy worked. After taking out Rex, the next few opponents were cakewalks. We take out Bones and his zombie strategy, Panic with his dark monsters, Bandit Keith and his powerful machines, and only have to restart against Pegasus and his tune cards once thanks to his arsenal of powerful spells like Change of Heart, just blowing me out the first time. Next up was Ishizu, Labyrinth Ruler, and finally, Richard Slyshin, the head of state for the Yorkists. This entire run was taking out handedly by my powerful insect strategy. It wasn't all terrain. There were times when I would have to bust out my ritual monster, Javelin Beetle, or wait what felt like a million turns for my Cocoon of Evolution to transform into the perfectly ultimate Great Moth. But for the most part, land was everything. Richard of York, our next opponent, gave me literal war flashbacks. He is the spitting image of Haitian, the main villain from Forbidden Memories. Going into this battle, I expected to finally hit a wall, for the bug deck to run its course and for me to have to go back to the drawing board, grind up for a different strategy, and take on this guy a few more times. What ended up happening shocked me. And that was nothing. Yeah, he was a chump. This guy, who is modeled after one of the hardest bosses in the entirety of the last game, fell victim to my insect deck just like all the rest. I guess I can't complain. Less grinding for me to do, but I honestly don't think I would have minded it. Grinding in Duelist of the Roses is far more forgiving and less tedious than in Forbidden Memories. At the end of each duel, you spin a slot machine which determines what 3 cards you win from that game. These options are made entirely from the cards you destroy during the game. So, to give yourself a higher chance of seeing a specific card, all you need to do is wait for your opponent to play the card, destroy it, then win the game to guarantee you have at least a chance to win it. The slot also seemed to be based entirely on timing. So, if you got the timing of the slot down, you could almost guarantee to get the card you wanted. On top of that, after 5 or so duels, you get to reincarnate a card, which means that you sacrifice one of the cards in your collection to receive 3 cards of similar value. This is the more random of the methods to gain cards, so it became less important than simply grinding the slot until you got what you wanted. But this grinding method is a breath of fresh air compared to the travesty that was inflicted upon me during Forbidden Memories. After Richard is taken out, Yugioh swoops in and fights a literal medieval battle, complete with knights, swords, horses, and all the mess that comes with war. It's a hilarious image. Yugioh freaking Moto riding atop a horse at the head of a literal medieval army, ordering a charge and watching the carnage. Just absolute insanity. Yugioh is crowned king and the game seems to be over. Or is it? Seto, or Rosencruz, is nowhere to be found. We chase him down at the Stonehenge-like altar that we were summoned from, and here, we defeat Kaiba in easy fashion. But not before he completes a ritual to summon forth another face that brought shock and horror to mine. A foe that threatened my entire run in Forbidden Memories. A foe I had hoped never to face again. Dark Knight. Or, in this game, Manawadon Fablier? I hope I got that right. In Forbidden Memories, this guy once had the ability to completely wipe the floor with me with powerful cards and a cheating strategy. No, I'm not kidding. I'm not just saying that because it's tough. He literally cheats. His whole deck is in his hand at all times. I feared he would do the same here, that he would stop me from finally beating this game after so many years. And he's done. Yep. He also stood no chance against the power of my bugs. Man, kind of anticlimactic. With Lear defeated, the Yorkists disappear, never to be seen again. Yugioh becomes King of England and is dubbed Yugioh, aka the King of Games, completely stealing all of our credit. He even leaves us behind with no confirmation whatsoever that we returned home. If anything, we were forgotten. Man, I don't know, Yugioh kind of seems like the bad guy here. Invading a foreign land, taking all of our credit for our duels, and not even sending us back home and forgetting that we ever existed. I think Yugioh's the bad guy. And that's the entirety of Duelist of the Roses. At least the first half. After finishing the campaign, you can now tackle New Game Plus, allowing you to complete whichever side you didn't choose, but keeping your collection you just earned. This made completing the harder Yorkist campaign much more doable. The Yorkist campaign sees you follow Kaiba as you duke it out against Yugioh's allies. It is way more linear than the Lancastrian campaign, whereas on Yugioh's side, you'd have multiple paths and enemies to choose from as your next target. Kaiba's side is a straight line. If you get stuck on a certain enemy, you're stuck until you can force your way through. A lesson I learned the hard way when I first booted up the game and chose the Yorkists on the fresh save file. I severely underestimated how hard it would be. With just a starter deck, even defeating the first enemy, Taya, was a trial. It took half an hour every duel with Taya just to either lose or squeak out a close victory. By the time I reached the third opponent, my Valentine, my deck was severely outclassed, and the types of decks Taya and Tristan can give you, even if you grind them enough, were not going to cut it. Challenging this campaign again, but this time with an already fully constructed insect deck from the first campaign, made all the difference. I had a brief moment where I thought, maybe I should grind for a brand new deck. Try something new for this campaign. I wanted to try my hand at a true pure dragon deck. But by the time this thought crossed my mind, I was already in the Yorkist campaign and had no access to a good opponent to grind dragons from. With that plan shot down, I just tackled each opponent, expecting to change strategies once the challenge became too overwhelming. And it never did. I finished the Yorkist campaign in just around 2 hours. It was even easier than the primary campaign. Now, part of that is probably because I didn't have to grind for cards like I did in the first campaign. But even still, another part of it was that I had some easy matchups. Yugi's grandpa is an opponent in this mode, and his entire strategy revolves around stalling until you can collect all 5 pieces of Exodia, because of course it is. The problem is that not only do you have to collect all the pieces, you must also place them on the board in a specific order to trigger victory. With enough aggression, you can corner his leader and prevent this from ever happening. Another time, I won against Bakura in a record-breaking 2 minutes. I'm not sure what his AI was thinking, but he basically just handed me a free victory. By the time he reached the king of games himself, Yugi, it felt like nothing could stop me. And nothing did. We defeated Yugi in swift fashion, and Kaiba enacted the Rose Ritual to send us home. But wouldn't you guess it, our buddy Dark Knight is back, and this time he's enraged. He references anger at his brother being summoned and sealed away back in ancient Egypt, a subtle nod to forbidden memories, linking these two games in some kind of weird historical continuity. Kaiba has this weird throwaway line where seconds after summoning this guy, he says that he failed, still unsure what exactly his goal was, and just comes up on the spot with some line about how we have to be the ones to defeat this guy because, well, the legends say anyway. The way this game is written is so jarring. They throw these random lines at you as if they had some kind of mandate to give you some explanation as to why characters are the way they are, and then they just brush past it without a second word. You just sit there and have to say, okay, cool, I guess, and move on. Once again, just as before, we take him down with ease. After this, Kaiba apologizes to us for the trouble and explains his motivations. Kaiba is from a lineage that believes in re-establishing a pact with the so-called Card Guardian. All of his actions were in pursuit of this goal for the sake of his family and his lineage. As a token of thanks for our service, he grants us a pendant that can be used in the future to call upon the service of the descendants of the Yorkists at any time. He then sends us back to our own time, disbands his own army, and Yugi becomes the King of England regardless. This campaign could be considered the good ending compared to Yugi's. We get to go back to our own time, Yugi becomes King of England anyway, and Kaiba gives the player something that will be useful later on, whereas Yugi just takes all your credit and then forgets about you. Of course, the entire narrative is told in a weird, choppy way, so it's not like they put a whole lot of thought into it, but it's still kind of interesting that this is how Kaiba's story ends. Duelist of the Roses is an odd piece of Yu-Gi-Oh history. It marks the beginning of an era in Yu-Gi-Oh video games where Konami just threw any and all ideas at the wall, hoping something would stick. Taking the characters from Yu-Gi-Oh and just throwing them into a famous historical conflict is as weird in practice as it was in theory. There may have been some world in which this worked, but the way in which this major element of the game's setting and story feels just kind of thrown in at the last moment makes me wonder why it's even here in the first place. It feels like someone at Konami had this concept art of Kaiba wearing this admittedly awesome looking Blue Eyes armor and then built the entire concept around that, picking the Wars of the Roses just for the sake of it, rather than actually thinking it all through. The gameplay itself is equally as weird. It's only vaguely Yu-Gi-Oh thanks to the monsters being used. This game has more in common with something like a Fire Emblem than an actual Yu-Gi-Oh card game. This wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing if the gameplay was great, but it's not. Once you've gotten the hang of it, duels take way too long on average. Strategies boil down to controlling more land and bigger monsters than your opponent, and becomes too stale too quickly. Duelist of the Roses isn't a bad game. It's a nice hit of nostalgia if, like me, you remember playing this game as a kid. But as a game itself, heck, as a representation of Yu-Gi-Oh, it does not hit the mark like I wish it did. I don't regret playing it, but I can't see myself playing it again. They don't even give you much incentive to play after the 2 campaigns. You can play multiplayer, and if you go back to the campaign, every enemy from both campaigns can now be fought indefinitely, but that's about it. No super bosses waiting for you, no collectibles, no real reason to play beyond the main campaign. It's a game I respect for what it tries to be, but not one I respect for what it is. The music slaps though. Duelist of the Roses was a wild experience, and I'm curious what your guys' experiences are with it. Have you ever played Duelist of the Roses? What did you think about it? Comment down below and let me know your thoughts. Konami wasn't quite done experimenting with the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise. The next game coming out on consoles for Yu-Gi-Oh was False-Bound Kingdom for the GameCube. Unlike Duelist of the Roses, I never played that one as a kid, so I literally have no idea what to expect. Is it going to be like Duelist of the Roses? Is it going to be as weird as Duelist of the Roses? You'll just have to stick around to find out. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single video on my channel, especially when I upload that False-Bound Kingdom video. And if you click on the screen now, you can watch my experience playing Forbidden Memories, the first ever Yu-Gi-Oh game on consoles on PlayStation 1 from start to finish. It was a wild time. With that, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.